it's time for Halloween month, and what better way to kick it off than by starting with my review of one of the most well-known horror film franchises ever, and that's the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. In this review, we'll be looking at Nightmare on Elm Street 1 through 3, and over the next couple weeks, we'll be doing the rest of the films. Let's not waste any time. Let's get started. In these reviews, I'm not going to go into too much detail about the story summaries like my regular reviews, because most people should know what the storylines are about in these films. The first Nightmare on Elm Street is about a group of teenagers who are being haunted in their dreams by a character named Freddy Krueger, a child murderer who was burned alive many years before this. He kills most of the teenagers until one teenager stands up to him named Nancy Thompson, and she actually brings Freddy out of the dream world and fights him. Nightmare on Elm Street's story is, in my opinion, one of the most creative stories ever written in horror film. All of us fear nightmares, but to write a character that can not only haunt you in your nightmares, but can also kill you in your nightmares as well as kill you in real life, and that's a scary concept, and that's what makes it a very appealing tale. I think the real interesting part about A Nightmare on Elm Street is that the nightmares are not in the movie as much as they would be later on in the franchise. That's what gives the movie its suspense. The film builds up to each nightmare and gives enough time for the tension to build. But you know that when a nightmare is going to happen, that one of the other characters is going to die. And instead of having endless amount of nightmares, it lets you wait it out, building up the anticipation for the next one, which I think is a pretty cool concept and is something that the later films lacked. When it comes to horror movie killers, Freddy Krueger is one of my favorites. He's not only creepy, but he's also very entertaining to watch. Krueger has a quality that no other movie killer has. He has the ability to entertain you as well as scare you in the first movie, which is quite a unique characteristic for a movie like this. Wes Craven had to make a lot of revisions to the character in order to fit the budget that the film had. The first revision was Krueger's hand. Initially, the hand was supposed to be all meat and bones, with knives coming out of the fingers, but due to the budget and the fact that Robert Englund already needed a lot of makeup to begin with, the hand was changed to just a leather glove with knives. The second is just the backstory of the character. It was originally written to where Krueger was not only a child murderer, but also a molester. The molester part was taken out, and Craven only kept in the child murderer part, even though some of the characteristics of Krueger still do point back to that original storyline. The last was just the attitude of the character. Feeling that Krueger might be a little too scary, they made the character a little more campy, when the original tone of the character was initially very dark, serious, and much more violent. I think all of these changes worked out for the better and made Krueger a far more entertaining character. I'll be honest with all of you, I'm not a gore fan. I love more methodically paced horror movies that are more based on suspense and scares rather than blood and guts. A Nightmare on Elm Street is very much a gore film, but it's done more creatively than violently. Most films just put in gore for the sake of having gore in the film with no real creativity behind it. A Nightmare on Elm Street gets very creative with the violence, which is what I think makes it more watchable than most films in this genre. The one that is really cool is the blood coming out of the bed. That was a pretty cool and fun scene to watch on screen. Acting-wise, A Nightmare on Elm Street stands pretty tall in this genre. Robert Englund was the perfect choice as Freddy Krueger. He brought so much to that character that it was really hard to picture someone else playing him. Heather Langenkamp as Nancy I really liked too. She brought a certain vulnerableness and also a boldness to the character that was needed to contrast with the qualities of the sinister Krueger. John Saxon I also liked as the father Don. While there are moments throughout the film where the father character can be a little bit of a dumbass, he brings a sense of realism to the character as well and is not just an unseen parent figure like other parents in horror films. The last actor I'll bring into this is Johnny Depp as Glenn, mainly because he's an actor that would wind up becoming one of the best actors on screen, and yet his first movie performance is actually his worst. Depp is just insanely over the top, and seeing how good of an actor he would become just makes this role much more entertaining to watch. So overall, there is a quality to A Nightmare on Elm Street that just makes it such a joy to watch. Yes, it is gory, but the gore actually has a purpose for being in the movie, which I like. A Nightmare on Elm Street wound up becoming a humongous success, and a sequel was immediately put into production to capitalize on that success, and a sequel would release titled A Nightmare on Elm Street 2: Freddy's Revenge. The story sees Freddy kind of return, but this time he's using the main character in this film, Jesse, to do his killing for him in the real world rather than in dreams, and through Jesse, Freddy comes back into the real world. This is probably one of the worst ideas they ever could have come up with. Call the second film Freddy's Revenge, and yet we see very little of Freddy himself. They pretty much took the great concept of the first film and said screw that and went in their own direction. Wes Craven literally wanted no part of this film, intending A Nightmare on Elm Street to be a standalone horror film, and actually wanting a happy ending to the first film, and yet never getting to do that. This movie pretty much jumped about 1,000,000 sharks with its third act alone. Bringing Freddy into the real world again wasn't necessarily a bad idea, but just the way they did it made it bad. What should have at least been a somewhat violent and scary part of the film turned into a campy and rather humorous scene, mainly because of the way Robert Englund played it and how unconvincing the rest of the cast is when they see him. However, I will give the film this. Its ending was good. They managed to have one really good scene with Krueger driving a bus with our main characters, and yet it was saved until the end of the movie, and by that time people had probably already walked out of theaters. Unlike the first film, there seems to be no direction with the violence and gore in the film. It's pretty much your typical horror film violence with all cool-looking blood and violence, but no reason behind it. The cast is just dreadful when compared to the first film. I'll give Robert Englund credit. He tries his damnedest to give a good performance in his 15 minutes of screen time, but the script just didn't allow him the freedom that he had with the character in the first film, which just completely ruins his efforts. Mark Patton is just dreadful. He doesn't even try to do Englund's performance any justice. If he had just studied Englund's performance from the first film a little more, he might have saved himself, but he just does his own thing, and it just sucks that way. The rest of the cast is just unwatchable. There's no effort whatsoever, and I don't see the point on discussing the acting any further than that. So overall, Freddy's Revenge is not even close to being Freddy's Revenge. The movie has no direction with its story, the violence is senseless, and the main villain is hardly seen despite the movie's title. So this movie is just a waste of time and money. Despite the bad reception the movie got, it was still a success at the box office and warranted another sequel. This time, effort would be put into this one, and Wes Craven would return to help out with the screenplay. The film would be titled Nightmare on Elm Street 3: Dream Warriors. I have to admit, I almost didn't watch this film because of its damn title. Dream Warriors? For some reason, I hated that title then, and I continue to hate it to this day. The story sees Nancy's return, but this time she's a research scientist at a psychiatric hospital. All of the kids in this hospital are being tormented by Krueger in their dreams, and one patient, Kristen, actually has the ability to bring other people into her dreams. Nancy sees this as a way to defeat Krueger. I love this story. It's a bit choppy in areas, but overall the plot is very strong and easily makes up for the poor plot of the second film. This film should have been Freddy's Revenge because that's pretty much what the premise is. I consider this movie to be the point where Freddy Krueger was starting to become less serious and more aimed to be kind of a campy sort of villain. In the first Nightmare on Elm Street, he was equally both, but in 2 and 3, the character more leaned towards the campy and funny side, while still retaining a bit of the creepiness, but nothing was really scary about him. While I would consider this a flaw for a horror movie, I think it winds up working in this franchise's favor. It makes Freddy Krueger different. He's not just a stalker and a killer. There's more depth to him than that. It gives him more of a psychological edge over the rest of the horror movie killers. On that note, the murders are more outrageous as well, but I think the thing that makes it work is that none of the murders are particularly gory or too bloody. They're more of a visual spectacle now. While they're still insanely violent and rather disturbing in some cases, the movie goes for murders that are even more creative than that of the first movie. I especially like the scene where we see the giant Freddy Krueger head. It's not a murder scene, but just the way they did it is just really impressive work, especially for 1987. From an acting standpoint, I feel it's both good and bad. I love the performance of Robert Englund. By this point, there was no way they were recasting that part. Robert Englund brings such great presence to the screen, and I was very happy that Krueger was more present in this film than he was in the last film. Heather Langenkamp is also very impressive, and it was very nice to see her back in the franchise again. The rest of the cast is a bit iffy. I think the only other performance worth mentioning is Patricia Arquette as Kristen. She does fine. It's not Oscar-worthy, but I've seen worse performances in this genre of film. So overall, as much as I hate the title of the film, Dream Warriors definitely makes up for the second film. There's nothing really scary about it from a horror standpoint, but the story, characters, and the visual style definitely make up for that. Well, that's Nightmare on Elm Street 1 through 3. Tune in next week as I take a look at 4 through 6 and see how Freddy Krueger continues to evolve in this long-running franchise. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next time.